my name is Ryan and I'll be your instructor for this journey we're taking together through the NSE5. We'll start by understanding who these videos are aimed for and what they're hoping to achieve. We'll then touch base on how to get the most out of this video series, following a brief overview of the plan moving forward. We'll then jump into the FortiManager introduction, asking questions like what is a FortiManager, what is an ADOM, look at some real world scenarios and so forth. You can contact me 3 ways: here on YouTube, via LinkedIn or Twitter. Let's start by having a conversation around who should be watching this video series. Now ideally the target audience should be someone with the NSE4 certification or an engineer with the older FCNSA or FCNSP. However, if you don't have the certification, I would expect an engineer to have at least 2 years of experience with the FortiGates to really get the most out of this video series. Last but not least will be the management element. Sections of this course can be used by management and pre-sales to understand what can be achieved by the FortiManager and FortiAnalyser and how that will benefit their business. As we go through these videos, it's key that you watch and you read, and with that information you actually learn and deploy, whether that's part of a practice environment or a real world deployment. And last but not least, the ultimate goal is to take that test and to hopefully pass it. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the FortiManager, I want to have a few seconds out just to discuss how you can get the most out of this class. When I study, I use these 4 points to help me through the process, and that's to observe, to validate, to discuss and deploy. Now when I'm talking about observe, it's about sitting back and relaxing and learning at your own pace. It's to take notes and to go over those notes because repetition is key, and it's to understand those concepts. Now don't be afraid to repeat. Throughout this course there'll be sections you'll find harder than others, and that's just a normal process of studying. So go back, watch them, review them, validate. So not everything I'm going to tell you is going to be correct. There's going to be errors in there. Things change, firmware updates happens, and processes and best practices change. Whatever I tell you, you need to take it away, you need to validate it, you need to understand, and you need to use multiple sources. No one book or not one video series is going to give you the certification and the full knowledge to understand a complex topic. Discuss, meaning there are plenty of people out there in the same boat as you. Speak to them on the forums. Maybe your colleagues are going through the same studying process. Maybe you have a question that somewhere out there in the community can help you. Also check out the Fortinet knowledge base articles and their actual YouTube channel. There's plenty of information on there. Deploy. So this is the most important part. Sitting and observing, validating and discussing is great. However, it doesn't allow you to actually cement that knowledge. Understand it at its core, and to be able to present it and deploy it and do it yourself, you need the hands-on experience. And that's where that deploy element comes in. You need to make sure that you as an individual can actually do the task that's at hand, not just have notes about how you believe it should be done. So what's the plan? How do we achieve the NSE5? Now, as we know, it's a 2-part exam. Half it's FortiManager, half it's FortiAnalyser. Now this part of the video series is actually going to go through the FortiManager element first. Let's have a look at the steps involved to achieve the NSE5. First, we're going to look at the FortiManager. We're going to have an introduction into it. Second, we're going to review the system settings. Third, the device manager. Fourth, the policy and objects. Fifth, we're going to look at the additional system and operations. What is FortiManager? At its heart, it's a centralized device manager allowing you to manage your entire Fortinet estate. It allows us to have up to 10,000 Fortinet devices and VDOMs in a single management interface. It's important then that you understand that the VDOM element of a FortiGate counts as a license within the FortiManager. So, for example, if you had a FortiGate with 5 VDOMs, each VDOM will consume a license within the FortiManager. It introduces a new concept of ADOMs, which are administrative domains. These allow us to, just like a VDOM within a FortiGate, logically segment the FortiManager into smaller areas, or, if you would like, smaller FortiManagers. You could do this to allow particular customers to have access to a particular ADOM, Maybe they have a group of FortiGates that they wish to manage, or maybe your company has different administrative domains. You have a group of engineers that deal with the FortiCarriers, a group of engineers that deal with the FortiGates, and you want them to have their own ADOMs so they can manage their own devices, but still keep the benefits of what FortiManager has to offer. Mass provisioning can be achieved on the FortiManager. For example, with the firewall policy element, this allows you to create a FortiGate on site, add the policies and objects you require, and then export that into the FortiManager within a policy package, and then simply deploy those objects and policies onto another FortiGate. You can do things like device settings. Those are things such as DNS, SNMP, network configurations, or device level settings. They can be put onto templates or provisioning templates and pushed out to multiple devices, or if a device is already live, they can be put into a script, and the script can be rolled out across multiple devices. The FortiManager also allows us to do the configuration, revisioning and tracking element from a central location. This allows us to understand who's made the change, when they made the change, was the change approved, was it declined. If the change was made, we can actually see what changes were made and revert those changes if it happened to cause an issue with that particular device. We can have the FortiManager act as a private FortiGuard distribution server. At the moment, you most likely have an estate of Fortinets all reporting into the FortiGuard distribution network and pulling down their own signatures and their own firmware updates and being pushed their own information from the actual FortiGuard. That can now be changed. You can have a single device, the FortiManager, and have all your Fortinet estate query the FortiManager to understand if it's got any firmware updates, and have the public FortiGuard network push updates to the FortiManager rather than the devices themselves. Obviously that lowers like bandwidth to each device. It lowers the latency onto the FortiGates. You can have the scheduled updates and the scheduled firmware. That can also be achieved in the FortiManager. Maybe you have a particular policy that a customer wants to apply at a particular time when the office is quiet. That can all be done through the FortiManager. We can do the VPNs through the FortiManager. We can do mesh, star, or dynamic, just like we can on the FortiGate. The benefit of doing it through the manager would be to have a single phase 1 and a single phase 2, and then deploy that across multiple devices rather than having to console into each device. The logging and reporting can also be done within the manager. Just like the analyzer, the manager can pull together SQL-based reports. All those reports can also be put into FortiAnalyser. The main difference between the analyzer and the manager is ultimately how much logging the manager can handle. Only the lower end to sort of mid can only handle around 2 gig, and the higher ends can handle a lot more. However, FortiManager wasn't designed to have high levels of logging and reporting, hence why the FortiAnalyzer is in existence. And later on the course we'll come to the FortiAnalyzer and we'll have a look in more detail what it can do for us and why we would get a sole FortiAnalyzer and why wouldn't we just have all of our login put into the FortiManager. A few things to note: the FortiManager does support APIs. It supports the SDK API, the JSON API and the XML API. Just like other Fortinet devices, some information can only be pulled from the CLI. Even though Fortinet is primarily built around their GUI, there are some information that can only be done via the CLI. An example of that is actually the diagnosed DVM support-platform list. This pulls a list that the FortiManager supports. So we can see here it supports the FortiController 5902D, it supports the FortiGate 50B, and to the right of that it tells you what firmware version within that device it supports. It's important to know this because if your estate is a wide range of older firmwares and much newer firmwares, then you may require multiple FortiManagers to actually ensure the entire estate is actually managed from a central point. Ultimately, they've got the same hardware and software platform, practically the same. You can actually see from some of the tabs that I'm about to pull up in a moment, the configuration is almost identical in some areas. Which is great because it makes it easy for us, especially for the people that are actually heading for the exam. The FortiManager has all the tabs available to you. Now, ultimately what I mean by that is we can see, just looking at these tabs, you have the device manager, the policy and objects, the FortiGuard, and the system settings. Now I will get into details a bit later about what each tab actually allows us to do, and when we log into the FortiManager we can see for ourselves. But for now I just want to give you a screenshot of the difference between the analyzer and the manager. So you can see with the analyzer at the bottom there, the additional tabs being the FortiView, the Event Manager, and the reports. All of those can actually be enabled from the FortiManager. Okay, the FortiManager can actually be a FortiAnalyser. It can do the login and the reporting and the event management. The limitation purely being the login element. As I discussed earlier, the lower to mid-range can only do 2 gig. Okay, and the higher ones will determine depending on the license and model. Now, if you are in a FortiManager and you want to change it to a FortiAnalyser, it's pretty straightforward. Inside the FortiManager itself, you would actually navigate to the system settings, and within the system settings, you'll see the system information widget. And that's right, the FortiManager and Analyzer has widgets just like the FortiGates do. And just on the system information widget, just at the bottom there, highlighted, you can see it has the enable and disable option. A key thing to keep in mind here is if you enable it, it will reboot the device. So here we are, going to go over the FortiManager tabs in more detail. You can see at the top I've got the FortiManager with the standard output, the device manager, policy and objects, FortiGuard and system settings, and at the bottom there the additional tabs enabled with the FortiAnalyser. Let's start with the system settings. These are the settings for the actual FortiManager themselves, not for the settings for the devices it manages. So they include administrative controls, who can access the FortiManager, ADOM control, create ADOMs, put devices in the ADOMs, networks, so like static routing, DNS, interface IPs, whether it should be the SSH or Telnet, and HA, because you can have the FortiManager and HA pair, SNMP certificates, and so forth. We've also got the device manager section. This is where you would create new ADOMs, you would group devices, install devices, provision new devices, put the provision templates on. Ultimately, this is where we manage the device itself at a device level. Okay, so anything that's not a policy, an object, or a security profile will get managed here in the device manager. The policy and objects contains all your global and local policy objects. So we're going to talk a bit later about what's the difference between a global ADOM and a normal ADOM, but for now, any global and local policies will be in there, and any object will be in there, and any security profiles, so any web filtering, any IPS, anything like that will remain in there. The FortiGuard section, this is where we can enable the FortiManager to be a private FortiGuard distribution server for our network, and then it syncs its local copy with the FortiGuard distribution network and downloads the firmware based on the devices it's managing, and then we can have all of our FortiGates query this for reputation on URLs, for IPS signatures, updates, and so forth. Going on with the FortiAnalyser element within the FortiManager. So this is where we've actually gone to the manager and we've enabled the Analyzer feature set. It gives us the FortiView. This is a real-time and historic logging, so top destinations, top sources, and this is where the information is actually pulled for the reporting element and for the event management, which is the next section. The event manager allows us to configure event handles based on our log type or a filter that we've previously configured. Maybe we want an alert or an email sent to a administrator if a IPS signature is detected, or if a particular person goes to a website, we want an SNMP trap sent or a syslog notification. That's what event manager allows us to actually achieve. Last but not least, reports. Reports are ultimately based on the logging we retrieved from our Fortinet devices, and they can be pulled together from a dataset using a custom or built-in SQL syntax, allowing us to create charts and pulling multiple charts together into a report. Maybe this is for a customer to show them how the network is performing. Maybe it's for the security manager to advise him what threats have been happening on the platform. Whatever it may be, there's most likely a report or a custom report that can be built for that particular job. I've talked about this multiple times throughout the training already, and I'm going to go back to it again. It's ADOMs, which are administrative domains, and it's one of the key concepts to understand for the FortiManager and FortiAnalyser. As I said previously, it's essentially a way to separate the FortiManager or Analyzer into logical sections. Allows us to break up the administrative control to maybe supply access to an end user or another administrator. And it's good to think of it as a container for a device, or again a smaller FortiManager within the larger FortiManager. Within each ADOM there's a common object database, and what we mean by that is if we have multiple FortiGates inside the same ADOM, they will actually be sharing the same object database. So if you want to keep your FortiGates separate and you want them to have their own object database, then you need to put them in their own separate ADOM. A concept I touched on earlier, which was the global ADOM. As you can see from this hierarchical scale, the global ADOM sits above the two ADOMs we've got here, customer 1 and customer 2, and the global ADOM enables us to create things called headers and footer policies. An example of this would be we can create a footer policy at the global ADOM to ensure that any traffic that do not meet any other policy to be denied. So that's normally a default policy that you would find at the bottom of most firewalls. However, creating it at global ADOM level and then applying it as a footer to the lower ADOM levels prevents a customer from logging into their particular ADOM and deleting that. Because ultimately the global footers and headers, as the name suggests, header goes above all of the policy and the footers go below all of the policies within a particular ADOM. And later on we'll go into actually creating policies within the global ADOM and assigning them to the actual individual ADOMs, so you'll see visually how that works. But for now, understand it as a global hierarchical ADOM that allows you to enforce policies on lower ADOMs. There's not much left to go over regarding the ADOMs, but there are a few important notes that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about them. I've mentioned that there are global ADOMs, and that's a single ADOM that's created when you enable the ADOM element of the FortiManager. And again, that's a automatically generated hierarchical ADOM that allows us to apply header and footer policies to the ADOMs that we as administrators create. Now those types of ADOMs come in two flavors. The first flavor being a normal ADOM. This is the default and it's a read-write ADOM and considered a top-down architecture. 9 out of 10 times this is the ADOM that you'll be creating. It's an ADOM that allows the Fortinet device to be purely managed by the FortiManager. All changes to policies, to security profiles, objects created, maybe you want to change the SNMP, wherever it may be, it has to be done through the FortiManager, and then the FortiManager will then install it onto the device. The FortiGate will keep querying the FortiManager using the FortiGate to FortiManager protocol over the TCP port 5199 to ensure that the configuration is in sync and up to date. However, this means that they have to log into the FortiManager to modify the device. If they log into the FortiGate, it will pop up with an error advising that changes are recommended to be done on the FortiManager. An administrator can override that and make the change on the FortiGate directly. However, if they do this, they will have to be re-imported into the FortiManager in order to resync back up. The second element is a backup ADOM. The backup ADOM is a read-only and the opposite architecture of a normal ADOM. This is where all the changes are actually made on the device itself, and you only have the backup element and the scripting element. So what I mean by that is you don't get that warning when you log into the FortiGate, and any change that you make, once you hit a certain threshold, so in this case the configuration change session times out, or you configure a change and you log out, or you configure a change and you reboot, or you manually back it up, it will resync the configuration back up to the FortiManager. And from the FortiManager, an admin can see who made the change, what change was made, and they can also revert it back. Now, ADOMs aren't enabled by default. Just like VDOMs in a FortiGate, we have to go in and enable it. And thankfully, it's pretty straightforward. We just navigate to the system settings, and from there move into the system information widget, exactly the same place where we went for the FortiAnalyser feature. However, just above it, you can see that we can enable the administrative domains. Once they're enabled, the ADOM drop-down would appear, and all the ADOMs that you configure will also appear. And clicking on each ADOM, just like a FortiGate, it will place you inside its own individual FortiManager with all the tabs that you would expect at the root level. I've done a lot of talking, primarily around ADOMs. What we're going to do now is jump into an actual FortiManager and configure an ADOM and just get a feel of what it looks like. Okay, so here we are. We're actually just about to log into the FortiManager. I'm going to enter my username and leave my password as blank. Hopefully your FortiManager is going to be more secure than mine. It's highly recommended to have a complex password and not to leave it as the default, which is blank. I get prompted there for the license because I am running the evaluation license. Now to enable the ADOM, which is the goal of this small task, is to simply click on the system settings along the top, and instantly it will put us into the dashboard. From the dashboard at the top we've got the system information widget, and from here we can do the two things that I've previously discussed. We can enable and disable the FortiAnalyser feature set, which will give us the 3 new additional tabs along the top, but we're here to enable the administrative domains. Now as soon as we enable this, we will actually get kicked out of the box. Now it doesn't reset, but it will kick us out to rearrange the GUI. When we log back in, you'll notice at the top left there that I have a drop down box now of root level ADOMs. As for the global ADOM, you may be wondering where that is. The global ADOM only appears under the policy and objects section here. And if we were to go into that global ADOM, you can see under the global policy package we can create the header policies and the footer policies that I previously discussed. Now we've enabled the ADOM element, we're actually going to create an ADOM. So again, back to system settings, we have the second option down, which is all ADOMs. Clicking on this brings up all the ADOMs that we currently have on our device. You'll notice that we have the analyzer, the cache, the client, the mail, the manager, and so forth. These are default ADOMs that cannot be deleted. The reason these are enabled is because if you're not enabling for FortiGate, they will have to go inside their own ADOMs, which means even if you didn't want ADOMs but you wanted to add a FortiClient into here, ADOMs will need to be enabled to have the FortiClient inside that area. Only FortiGates can be added to the root level ADOM within the FortiManager. And the way we create a new ADOM is pretty straightforward. We click the create new option, it brings up a tab and asks us for some basic information. So here we're going to type a name, we're going to use the test. We type in the device, so I'm going to say this is a FortiGate. We select the version. The version is important because ultimately the version controls which syntax it pushes down to the device when we're using scripts and we're using those device templates. We select the mode for the ADOM. As previously discussed, we have the normal, which is the read and write, and it's a top level down architecture. Or we have the backup ADOM, which is the read-only, and it's the bottom architecture. We then have the VPN management, which we'll come to discuss a bit later, but to give you an idea, the policy and device VPNs is the default, and this allows you to have the VPN set up the way we, as administrators, are used to, as in you would have to log into each device within the FortiManager and configure the phase 1, the phase 2s, the policies, firewalls, and so forth. Or we have this newer option for the Essential VPN console, which allows us to centralize our IPsec configuration and create only one phase 2 and only one phase 1 within this manager and roll out to multiple FortiGates. I haven't added any devices to this FortiManager yet, and we'll do that together later, but any devices I have had would be on here, and we would simply select the device and move it across. Once we're all happy, pressing OK will create this ADOM. Now we've got the ADOM created and you've seen inside the FortiManager, I just want to take a few moments to talk about our last few things regarding this before we wrap up this lesson. We've touched on a few things regarding ADOMs primarily, and here are the highlights. ADOMs are not enabled by default. It's important you know how to enable them. System settings, dashboard, system information widget. We need to make sure we have the correct admin permissions. We will get into permissions later, but ultimately you need to be the super user administrator or a custom administrator profile with the correct settings. We need to know how to create an ADOM. There are actually two ways. You can do it through the system settings, the all ADOMs, and the create new section, which is the bit that we just done. Or we can go through the ADOM, we can hit the drop down, click manage ADOMs, and select new. We need to understand the required information, the name, the device type, the firmware, why it's important to have the correct firmware, the ADOM mode and what's the difference between those modes, and the VPN management. Again, we will touch more on that later, but understanding that there are two management modes when creating those ADOMs. You need to make sure you don't forget about that global ADOM, that hierarchical ADOM. It's a single global ADOM which sits above all ADOMs. Policies created here can be assigned to ADOMs to enforce global rules. Last but not least, there's a few questions I've put here that you can hopefully answer with me now. First of all, what is an ADOM? An ADOM is an administrative domain that allows us to logically segment the FortiManager. What are the different modes? There are two modes, normal and backup, and hopefully you know the difference between them. How do I create an ADOM? System settings, all ADOMs, create new. That was the way that we demonstrated just now. However, there are other ways to create the ADOMs. Are ADOMs enabled by default? No, they're not. Who can enable ADOMs? By default, it's the super user, but any administrator with the correct profile can enable them. Are ADOMs in FortiAnalyser? Yes, they are. Can a device exist in two ADOMs? No, it cannot. Can a device exist in a root ADOM? Only if it's a FortiGate. And what is the global ADOM? Which we know is a hierarchical ADOM that sits above all other ADOMs. View of this lesson, for the highlights, we've talked about the road ahead, how to get the most out of this series, and what the FortiManager is. We've also talked about how the FortiManager and the FortiAnalyser is different, all the same. We've also had a quick look at the FortiManager tab overviews and an ADOM overview, along with going into FortiManager and actually creating an ADOM. Last but not least, all that's left is for me to thank you for viewing, and if this video has been helpful, please do leave a like and subscribe.